Billionaire Elias Sterling hadn't touched a woman in 10 years, until struggling single mother Zariah Moore crashed into his hotel entrance on a stormy night. What began as a reluctant act of kindness turned into something far deeper. Could, she thawed his frozen heart, comment below where in the world you're watching from. The New York winter had never felt so cold to Zariah Moore as it did tonight. Rain mixed with sleet pounded against her old sedan's windshield as she drove through the darkened streets, her knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. In the back seat, 5-year-old Micah slept soundly, unaware that they had nowhere to go. "It's going to be okay," Zariah whispered, more to herself than to her sleeping son. The eviction notice had come 3 days ago, but she'd been hoping for a miracle. Maybe her last paycheck would clear. Maybe her deadbeat ex would finally send child support. Neither had happened. Tears blurred her vision as she squinted through. The windshield. The wipers were barely keeping up with the downpour. She should pull over, but where? They couldn't spend the night in the car in this weather. Micah would freeze. Her phone rang, the sound startling in the quiet car. It was her best friend, Leanne. "Please tell me you found somewhere to stay," Leanne said without greeting. "Not yet," Zariah admitted. "The shelters are full. I called everyone I know. I wish I could help, but with my sister's family staying." "Are with me?" I know," Zariah sighed. "I'll figure something out." As she hung up, the car hit a patch of black ice. The world spun in terrifying slow motion. Zariah screamed as she lost control, the sedan skidding across the empty street. There was a sickening crunch of metal against stone as the car slammed into what looked like an ornate private driveway entrance. When the world stopped spinning, Zariah's first thought was Micah. She turned around frantically. "Mommy?" His little voice was groggy with sleep, confused but unhurt. "It's okay, baby, we had a little accident." Her hands shook as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The front of her car was crumpled against a set of wrought iron gates. Beyond them, she could see a grand building with a lit entrance. Before she could process what had happened, security guards in dark uniforms rushed out, followed by doormen in long coats. Ma'am, you can't be here," one shouted as he approached the car. Zariah stepped out, the cold rain immediately soaking through her thin jacket. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I hit some ice. I'll call a tow truck." "This is private property," the guard continued, his voice stern. "This is the exclusive entrance to the Sterling Penthouse Hotel. You need to move your vehicle immediately." "I can't. It won't start," Zariah said, tears now freely mixing with the rain on her face. "My son is in the car." The guard's expression hardened. "That's not our problem. We'll have to call the police." "There's no need for that." The voice was deep, commanding. It cut through the rain like a knife. Everyone, including Zariah, turned toward the source. A tall man stood in the doorway of the building. Even from a distance, his presence was overwhelming. He wore an impeccable black suit, his dark hair slicked back, his face handsome but severe. He walked toward them, seemingly unbothered by the rain. "Mr. Sterling," the guard stammered, "we were just handling the situation." "I can see that, Richards." The man, Mr. Sterling, stopped a few feet from Zariah, his eyes cold and blue. As winter ice assessed her with unsettling intensity, Zariah felt small, vulnerable. She was suddenly aware of her worn jeans, her second-hand coat, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. "It was an accident," she explained, lifting her chin, despite her fear. "I hit some ice. I'll get a tow as soon as I can, but my son, you have a child with you." Something in his expression shifted. "Yes, my son. He's 5. Zariah glanced back at the car where Micah was now watching wide-eyed through the window. The man looked at the car, then at the guards, then back at Zariah. A long moment passed. Then, surprisingly, his face softened, just barely. "Bring your son inside," he said. "You can sort out the car in the morning." Zariah blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "Inside? Unless you'd prefer to stay in the rain." There was a hint of impatience in his tone. "No, Thank you," Zariah said, hurrying back to get Micah. As she unbuckled her son from his car seat, she whispered, "We're going to go inside for a bit while we figure things out, okay?" Micah nodded, rubbing his sleepy eyes, with her son in her arms and her purse over her shoulder. Zariah followed Mr. Sterling through the grand entrance of what she now realized was one of the most exclusive hotels in the city. The lobby was all marble and gold, with crystal chandeliers that made Micah gasp in wonder. "Wow, Mommy, it's like a castle," he whispered loudly. Mr. Sterling led them to an elevator that required a keycard to operate. Inside, he pressed the button for the top floor, the penthouse. "I'm Elias Sterling," he said finally, looking straight ahead at the elevator doors. "I own this hotel." Zariah's heart sank. Of course she had to crash into a billionaire's hotel. Just her luck. "I'm Zariah Moore. This is my son, Micah." She swallowed hard. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry about your gate. I don't have insurance right now, but I promise I'll find a way to pay for the damages." His expression remained unreadable. "We'll discuss that later." The elevator opened directly into a stunning penthouse apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the rainy New York skyline. The space was immaculate, modern, and cold. Beautiful but unlived in, like a museum. "Richards will bring up some towels," Elias said, checking his watch. "The guest room is through there. You and your son can stay the night." Zariah's pride flared. "We don't need charity." Elias raised an eyebrow. "It's not charity, it's basic human decency during a storm. Or would you prefer I call the police about the damage to my property?" Before she could respond, Richards arrived with towels and a tray with hot chocolate. "Thank you. That will be all." Elias dismissed him with a nod. After drying off Micah and helping him change into the only spare clothes she had in her purse, Zariah settled him on the couch with hot chocolate. The little boy was now wide awake, fascinated by the fancy apartment and the lights of the city below. "Are you a king?" Micah asked Elias suddenly, his brown eyes serious. A flash of surprise crossed Elias's face. "No, I'm just a businessman." "But you live in a castle." "It's not a castle, Micah," Zariah corrected gently, embarrassed. "It kind of looks like one," Elias said, his tone softer when addressing the child. Then to Zariah, "You never explained why you were driving in this weather with a child." Zariah hesitated, pride warring with honesty. "We were evicted from our apartment today. I was looking for somewhere to go." Something flickered in Elias's eyes. Recognition, sympathy. It vanished too quickly to tell. "I see," was all he said. After Micah had finished his hot chocolate and his eyelids began to droop again, Zariah carried him to the guest room. It was bigger than their entire apartment had been, with a king-sized bed that Micah immediately sprawled across. "Good night, my sweet boy," she whispered, kissing his forehead. When she returned to the living room, Elias was standing by the window, staring out at the city, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Thank you," Zariah said, her voice quiet. "For letting us stay tonight. You said you were evicted." He didn't turn from the window. "Why?" Zariah's cheeks burned with shame. "I lost my job last month. I've been picking up shifts at a diner, but it wasn't enough. And the child's father, not in the picture." Her tone made it clear she didn't want to elaborate. Elias turned then, studying her with that same intensity. "How you can stay until you find somewhere else?" Zariah's eyes widened. I have 20 empty guest rooms in this hotel," he cut her off. "It would be absurd to turn you out with a child during winter." "We'll be gone tomorrow," she insisted. "I just need to make some calls." Something like a smile, though not quite, touched his lips. "As you wish." That night, unable to sleep in the too-soft bed, Zariah crept back to the living room. She was surprised to find Elias still there, working on a laptop. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked up, seeming genuinely startled by her presence. "Not much." Zariah sat on the edge of the couch opposite him. "Why are you being so kind to us? You don't know me. I crashed into your hotel." Elias closed his laptop. For a moment he seemed to be considering his answer carefully. 10 years ago, he said finally, "I was homeless for 3 months. Not many people know that." The confession stunned her. "But you're a billionaire now." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't always." Before she could respond, his phone rang. He checked it, his expression darkening. "I need to take this," he said, standing. "Good night, Ms. Moore." After he left, Zariah sat in the quiet opulence of the penthouse, wondering what kind of man Elias Sterling really was. Cold and distant one moment, unexpectedly kind the next. What had happened to make a man with so much seem so empty? The next morning, Zariah woke to Micah's excited voice. Following the sound, she found him in the kitchen with Elias, who was awkwardly attempting to make pancakes. "Mr. Elias never made pancakes before, Mommy," Micah announced. Elias looked up, flour dusting his otherwise immaculate black sweater. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that vanished the moment he saw her. "Your son is an early riser," he said. "I'm so sorry," Zariah rushed to say. "Micah, you shouldn't have bothered Mr. Sterling." "He didn't bother me." Elias returned his attention to the misshapen pancake in the pan. "I was up." Zariah watched in amazement as this billionaire CEO continued his clumsy attempts at breakfast. Something about the scene made her heart twist unexpectedly. The doorbell interrupted the strange domestic moment. Elias frowned, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'm not expecting anyone," he muttered, moving to answer it. When the door opened, a stunning blonde woman in designer clothes swept in, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume and an air of entitlement. "Elias, darling, you're impossible to reach these days," she said, then stopped short when she saw Zariah and Micah. Her perfectly made-up face twisted in confusion. Who are these people? Elias's expression had completely closed, off, his body tense. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" The woman, Victoria, ignored his question, her eyes fixed on Zariah with growing disdain. "Don't tell me you've replaced me with this?" Zariah felt her face heat with anger and embarrassment. "They're guests," Elias said, his voice cold. "And you weren't invited?" Victoria laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Guests in your penthouse? You haven't had guests in a decade, darling." She stepped closer to him, placing a manicured hand on his chest. "Not since me." Elias removed her hand firmly. "We need to talk, in private." As he led Victoria to his office, she cast one last, contemptuous look at Zariah. "Mommy, who's that lady?" Micah asked once they were gone. "I don't know, baby," Zariah replied, but she had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who Victoria was to Elias. Loud voices carried from the office, Victoria's high and angry, Elias's low and controlled. Zariah couldn't make out the words, but the tension was clear. "We should go," she said to Micah, suddenly feeling like an intruder. "Let's get our things." As they gathered their few belongings, the office door opened and Victoria stormed out, her perfect composure cracked. "You'll regret this, Elias," she spat. "You think you've buried the past, but I'm still here. I'll always be here." She slammed the door on her way out. Seconds later, Elias emerged from the office, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I apologize for that," he said, when he saw Zariah and Micah ready to leave. "Where are you going?" "We should get out of your way," Zariah said. "I've been more than kind, but I told you can stay until you find somewhere else." "After what just happened, Victoria is my ex-fiancée," he interrupted. "She's also the reason I don't allow people into my personal space." Usually, the admission hung in the air between them. "What changed?" Zariah asked softly. Elias looked at Micah, who was busy drawing on a notepad he'd found, then back at Zariah. "I don't know," he admitted, and for the first time Zariah saw genuine confusion in those ice blue eyes. "But my offer stands." Before she could respond, her phone rang. It was the diner where she'd been picking up shifts. "Zariah, thank goodness," her manager said when she answered. "Jenny called in sick. Can you cover her shift today? It's a double." Zariah looked at Micah, then at Elias. "I don't have anyone to watch my son." Elias spoke without hesitation. "I'll watch him." Zariah's mouth fell open. But you're capable of looking after a child for a few hours." His tone was matter-of-fact. "Unless you don't trust me." The question hung between them. Did she trust him? This stranger who had taken them in, who seemed to be waging some internal war between coldness and kindness. "Micah, would you be okay staying with Mr. Elias while Mommy goes to work?" she asked, watching her son carefully. Micah looked up from his drawing, a surprisingly good rendition of Elias making pancakes. "Can we make more pancakes?" The corner of Elias's mouth twitched. "We can try." And so, with a mixture of doubt and desperate hope, Zariah left her son with the mysterious billionaire who had crashed into their lives, or perhaps it was the other way around. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed. Irrevocably. For better or worse remained to be seen. Elias Sterling stood at the window of his penthouse, watching Zariah's figure disappear into a taxi 16 floors below. What had possessed him to offer to watch her child? He hadn't interacted with children. Since he was one himself. Mr. Elias, Micah's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Can we make pancakes now? Elias turned to find the boy looking up at him with those enormous brown eyes, so trusting, so innocent. Nothing like the calculating gazes he was accustomed to in his world of corporate boardrooms and business deals. I'm not very good at it, Elias admitted. Micah shrugged. Mommy says practice makes perfect. Something about the simple wisdom made Elias smile, an expression so foreign to his face that it almost hurt. Your mother sounds smart. She's the smartest, Micah said with absolute conviction. She works really hard too, 3 jobs sometimes. Elias felt an unexpected pang. Zariah Moore was clearly a fighter, a survivor. Much like he had been once upon a time, the pancakes turned out slightly better than the first batch. As they ate, Elias found himself answering Micah's endless stream of questions about the hotel, his work, and whether he had any toys. I don't, Elias said, realizing how sterile his home was. But we could get some. Micah's eyes widened. Really? An hour later, Elias found himself in a toy store for the first time in decades, watching Micah run from shelf to shelf in wonder. He had instructed his assistant, Margaret, to clear his schedule for the day, something he had never done in 10 years of running Sterling Enterprises. Is there a limit? Micah asked cautiously, holding a small action figure. The question caught Elias off guard. What 5-year-old worried about limits in a toy store? No, he said softly. Get whatever you want. By the time they returned to the penthouse laden with bags, Elias had learned more about Micah's life than he had expected. The boy talked freely about moving a lot, about how his mom worked all the time, but always read him a story at night, about kids at school who made fun, of his second-hand clothes. Each revelation was like a knife to Elias's chest. He recognized too much of his own childhood in Micah's stories. Mr. Elias, do you have a mom and dad? Micah asked as they set up a train set in the living room. Elias focused on connecting 2 tracks. I did. They died when I was young. Mine. Too, well, my dad didn't die, he just left. Micah said this matter-of-factly. Mom says he wasn't ready to be a dad. Elias felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man who had abandoned his child. Sometimes people make bad choices, was all he said. The afternoon passed surprisingly quickly. Elias found himself on the floor playing with toy cars, something he couldn't have imagined doing that morning. For a few hours he forgot about Victoria's unwelcome visit, about the merger his company was negotiating, about the cold, empty life he had built for himself. When the elevator chimed at 6 p.m., both Elias and Micah looked up from their game. Zariah stepped into the penthouse, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. Her eyes widened at the sight that greeted her. Elias Sterling, billionaire CEO, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by toys, with Micah happily zooming a car over his expensive suit pants. What happened here? She asked, taking in the transformed living room. Micah jumped up. Mommy, Mr. Elias got me toys. We got cars and trains and robots and books and… Micah, she… interrupted, her voice tight. Go wash up for dinner, please. Once Micah had left the room, Zariah turned to Elias, who had stood up and was brushing off his pants. You bought him all this? Without asking me? Elias frowned. Was that wrong? Yes. No, I don't know. Zariah ran a hand through her hair. You can't just buy him a store full of toys. What message does that send? That he deserves nice things? Elias countered. That he needs a rich man to swoop in and save him, Zariah shot back. I have worked my entire life to provide for my son. I may not be able to buy him fancy toys, but he has never lacked for love or care. Elias's frown deepened. I never suggested otherwise. You don't understand what it's like, Zariah said, her voice breaking slightly. To have people look at you like you're failing because you can't give your child everything. To have your worth as a parent judged by your bank account. Something in Elias's expression shifted. Actually, I do understand. More than you know. Before Zariah could respond, Micah returned, his face freshly washed and eager. Can Mr. Elias stay for dinner? I told him you make the best spaghetti in the world. The tension in the room softened. Zariah looked from her son to Elias, whose face had that vulnerable quality again, as if he himself were the child seeking acceptance. I brought food from the diner, she said finally. There's enough for all of us. Dinner was a surreal experience for Elias. They ate at his rarely used dining table, Micah chattering about his day, Zariah occasionally stealing glances at Elias as if trying to figure him out. It was the first time in 10 years that anyone other than Victoria had eaten a meal in his home. After dinner, as Zariah was putting Micah to bed in the guest room, Elias's phone rang. It was Margaret. Sir, I've just received a concerning call from Ms. Hartley, his assistant said, referring to Victoria. She's threatening to go to the press with personal information if you don't call her back. Elias's jaw clenched. Let her. There's nothing she can say that would damage the company. She mentioned something about your childhood, about foster care. Elias felt his blood turn to ice. That was the one piece of his past he had managed to keep private. If that got out, the narrative he had carefully constructed, the story of Elias Sterling, self-made businessman, would be tainted by pity, by questions about his past that he refused to answer. I'll handle it, he said tersely before hanging up. When Zariah returned to the living room, she found Elias staring out the window again, his body rigid with tension. Is everything okay? She asked. Fine, he said, without turning around. Then, after a moment, you should know that my offer of allowing you to stay comes with complications. My ex-fiancée, Victoria, she's not happy about your presence here. Zariah crossed her arms. I got that impression. She and I were together for 2 years. She was the last person He paused, seeming to search for words. The last person. I like it close to me. It didn't end well. What happened? Zariah asked, then quickly added, Sorry, that's none of my business. To her surprise, Elias answered, She was engaged to me but sleeping with my brother, all while helping him embezzle from the company. His voice was flat, emotionless. I found out on our wedding day. Zariah's hand flew to her mouth. That's terrible. It was a valuable lesson. Elias finally turned to face her. Trust is a luxury I can no longer afford. So why trust us? Zariah asked quietly. Why let us stay? Elias looked in the direction of the guest room where Micah slept. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm beginning to think it was a mistake. The words stung more than Zariah expected. We'll be gone tomorrow, she said, lifting her chin. That's not what I meant. Elias ran a hand through his perfect hair, messing it up for the first time since she'd met him. I meant that I'm not good for people. I'm not the kind of person who should be around a child, around anyone. Zariah studied him, this man who seemed carved from ice, yet had spent the day playing with her son. I think you're wrong, she said finally. I think you're exactly the kind of person who needs people around. You've just forgotten how to be around them. Before Elias could respond, the elevator chimed again. Both turned, expecting Victoria. Perhaps instead, a tall man with a striking resemblance to Elias stepped into the penthouse. Where Elias was all controlled elegance, this man exuded casual charm. His suit was designer but rumpled, his smile easy but not reaching his eyes. Well, the newcomer said, looking Zariah up and down appreciatively. Victoria wasn't lying. James, Elias said, his voice colder than Zariah had ever heard it. What are you doing here? Can't a brother stop by to say hello? James Sterling moved further into the room, helping himself to a drink from Elias's bar. Especially when I hear there are guests. You never have guests, Eli. Don't call me that, Elias said through gritted teeth. And you're not welcome here. James ignored him, turning his attention to Zariah. I'm James Sterling, the fun brother. He extended his hand with a wink. Zariah shook it briefly. Zariah Moore. Beautiful name for a beautiful woman. James's smile widened. So how did you manage to crack my brother's frozen heart? 10 years of ice, and suddenly he's playing house. That's enough, Elias snapped. Zariah, would you excuse us? Uncomfortable with the tension between the brothers, Zariah nodded and retreated to the guest room. Through the door, she could hear their voices rising. What game are you playing, bringing strangers into your home? James was saying. My personal. Life is none of your concern. It is when Victoria is threatening to go public with your foster care past. Do you have any idea what that would do to our image? To the company? Our company? You lost the right to call it that when you stole from it, when you slept with my fiancé. Ancient history, brother. We've moved past that. You have, I haven't. The voices lowered and Zariah could no longer make out the words. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching Micah sleep peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding. After what seemed like an eternity, there was a knock at the door. Zariah opened it to find Elias, his composure restored except for a tightness around his eyes. I apologize for my brother, he said formally. He won't be returning. Elias, Zariah began, not sure what she wanted to say. Your family situation seems complicated. A bitter smile touched his lips. James is not my family, not anymore. But he's your brother. Blood doesn't make family, Elias said, his gaze drifting to the sleeping Micah. As you well know. The simple observation, acknowledgement of her struggle as a single mother, touched Zariah deeply. Tomorrow, Elias continued, I'm having my legal team look into your eviction. There may be grounds to fight it. Zariah blinked in surprise. You don't have to do that. I know. For a moment he seemed about to say more, but then simply nodded. Good night, Zariah. The next day, Zariah woke to find the penthouse empty, except for a note on the kitchen counter. Had to go to the office. Feel free to use anything in the kitchen. Margaret will assist if you need anything. E.S. Below his initials was a phone number and the name Margaret Chen. Zariah called the number, and a brisk, efficient woman answered. Ms. Moore, Mr. Sterling asked me to assist you today. What do you need? Swallowing her pride, Zariah explained about her car, still damaged and parked at the hotel entrance. A mechanic is already working on it, Margaret informed her. Mr. Sterling also asked me to help you with job applications if you're interested. By afternoon, Zariah had a list of promising job leads, an appointment with a legal aid attorney about her eviction, and her car in working order. When Elias returned that evening, he found Zariah and Micah in the kitchen. Micah was drawing at the counter, while Zariah stirred something that filled the penthouse with a delicious aroma. You're cooking, Elias said, sounding surprised. Zariah turned, a wooden spoon in hand. It's the least I can do, to thank you. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. Zariah met his gaze steadily. You've done more for us in 2 days than Micah's father has done in 5 years. Something flashed in Elias's eyes. Anger, but not at her. Any decent person would help. No, they wouldn't, Zariah said softly. Trust me, I know. Over dinner, a hearty stew that Elias admitted was the best meal he'd had in years, Zariah shared the progress she'd made that day. The legal aid attorney thinks I have a good case against my landlord, she said, and I have 2 job interviews next week. That's wonderful, Elias said, and seemed to mean it. After Micah went to bed, Elias surprised Zariah by offering her a glass of wine. They sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling below them. Why haven't you touched a woman in 10 years? Zariah asked suddenly, then covered her mouth. I'm sorry, that was in the note I saw on your nightstand. I wasn't snooping, I just... It's fine, Elias interrupted. It's not a secret. After Victoria, I found it difficult to trust anyone. Physical distance seemed safest. For 10 years, Elias sipped his wine. Time passes quickly when you're building an empire. But surely you've been lonely. Loneliness is preferable to betrayal. He looked at her curiously. What about you? Has there been anyone since Micah's father? Zariah laughed softly. When would I have time to date? Between 3 jobs and raising Micah, men aren't exactly lining up to date a struggling single mom anyway. Their loss, Elias said so quietly she almost didn't hear him. The moment stretched between them, filled with something new and unexpected. Zariah felt her heart beating faster. Then Elias's phone rang, breaking the spell. He checked it, his expression darkening. "Problem?" Zariah asked. "Victoria," he said, declining the call. "She's been trying to reach me all day." "What does she want?" Elias hesitated. "To ruin me, most likely. Or at least to control me." "Can she?" "She knows things about my past, things I'd prefer not to." "Become public." Zariah set down her wineglass. "We all have pasts, Elias. Some are more complicated than others." He stood up abruptly. "I should work. I've neglected things today." As he turned to leave, Zariah caught his hand, an impulse she immediately regretted when she felt him stiffen at the contact. "I'm sorry," she said, releasing him. "I just wanted to say thank you. Again." Elias looked down at his hand, then at her. "You're welcome," he said, his voice strangely rough. Later that night, unable to sleep, Zariah wandered out to the kitchen for water. She was surprised to find Elias still up, working at the dining table. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, echoing her question from their first night. He looked up and she was struck by how tired he looked. "Not tonight, apparently." Zariah hesitated, then said, "Is it because of what Victoria might reveal?" Elias closed his laptop. "Partly. What could be so bad that you're this worried?" For a long moment, Zariah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I spent 6 years in foster care," he said finally. "My parents died when I was 10. The system wasn't kind to me." Zariah sat down across from him. "I'm sorry. I don't want pity," he said sharply. "I survived. I built something from nothing." "It's not pity," Zariah said. "It's understanding. We're not so different, you know. Both fighting to rise above our circumstances." Elias studied her with those ice-blue eyes. "Perhaps," he conceded. Then, unexpectedly, "The worst home was when I was 14. The father was violent, especially when he drank." Zariah's heart ached for the boy he had been. "That's why you don't like to be touched." Elias's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her insight. "Partly," he admitted. "Victoria knew how difficult it was for me. She used it against me after I found out about her and James." "She sounds cruel." "She's determined," Elias corrected. "She believed she deserved a share of what I built. When I cut her out completely, she was unhappy. And now she's back." "Because of you," Elias said, his gaze intense. "She saw you here and assumed that I'm your girlfriend," Zariah finished. "Why would that bring her back after all this time?" "Because if I could move on with someone else, it means she no longer has power over me." Elias ran a hand through his hair, that small gesture of humanity that always caught Zariah by surprise. "And Victoria needs power. What will you do?" "What I've always done, survive." He stood up. "You should go back to bed, it's late." As Zariah turned to go, she paused. "Elias, for what it's worth, I think the boy who survived all that would be proud of the man you've become." Something in his expression cracked, just for a moment. "Good night, Zariah," he said softly. The next morning, Zariah woke to the sound of raised voices. She found Elias in the living room facing Victoria. "Again. You can't hide her away forever, Elias," Victoria was saying. "People are already talking. Who is this mysterious woman staying at the Sterling penthouse? How will it look when they discover she's some penniless nobody you pulled off the E Street?" "That's enough, Victoria," Elias said, his voice dangerous. Victoria turned as Zariah entered, her perfect smile not reaching her eyes. "Ah, here she is. Tell me, dear, has he told you about his tragic past yet?" "He loves to use it to make women feel sorry for him." "Get out," Elias said quietly. Victoria laughed. "Or what? You'll call security on me? Create a scene? You know how I love scenes, darling, almost as much as the press does." Zariah stepped forward. "What exactly do you want, Miss Hartley?" Victoria looked surprised that Zariah had addressed her directly. "What do I want? I want what's rightfully mine, half of everything he has." "You have no right to anything of mine," Elias said. "Don't I? Who was there in the beginning, Elias? Who believed in you when you were nothing? Who connected you with the investors that made your first venture possible? And who betrayed me with my own brother? Who stole company funds? Elias's control was slipping, his voice rising. Victoria's smile widened. "Careful, darling, your ice is melting." She turned to Zariah. "That's what they call him, you know. The man with the frozen heart. He wasn't always so cold. I made him that way." "You're wrong," Zariah said, surprising both Victoria and herself with her boldness. "You didn't make him anything. He survived you, just like he survived everything else." Victoria's perfect composure slipped for a moment. She looked from Zariah to Elias, her eyes narrowing. "This is interesting," she said softly. "You actually care about her. The great Elias Sterling, falling for a charity case." "That's enough," Elias said, stepping between them. "Say what you came to say, Victoria, and then get out." Victoria's smile returned, colder than ever. "Fine, here's my offer. Give me what I deserve, 20 million and a public apology for how you treated me, or I go to the press with everything. Your foster care past, the abuse, the night you almost—" "Stop," Elias cut her off, his face pale. "Just stop." "You have 48 hours to decide," Victoria said, picking up her designer handbag. "Oh, and one more thing. Your brother wants a meeting. Something about the Donovan merger." After she left, Elias stood motionless, his back to Zariah. "Elias," she said softly. "I need to be alone," he said, his voice hollow. Without another word, he walked to his office and closed the door. Zariah stood in the middle of the penthouse, feeling more like an intruder than ever. Whatever crisis Elias was facing, it was because of her presence here. Because of her, his carefully constructed walls were crumbling. She made a decision. Quickly, she packed up their few belongings, wrote a note thanking Elias for everything, and left it on the kitchen counter. "Come on, Micah," she said, helping her drowsy son into his coat. "We need to go." "But what about Mr. Elias?" Micah asked, looking around. "Don't we say goodbye?" Zariah swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's busy, baby, but we'll send him a thank you card, okay?" As the elevator doors closed, taking them away from the penthouse that had briefly felt like a sanctuary, Zariah wondered if she would ever see Elias Sterling again, the man with the frozen heart who had, just for a moment, begun to thaw. Elias emerged from his office 2 hours later, his mind made up. He wouldn't give in to Victoria's blackmail. Whatever she revealed about his past, he would weather the storm. He'd survived worse. "Zariah?" he called, realizing the penthouse was oddly quiet. "Micah?" When no answer came, a strange feeling settled in his chest, something like panic, but unfamiliar. He moved quickly through the rooms, finding them empty. In the guest room, the bed was made, the toys neatly arranged. On the kitchen counter, he found the note. "Elias, thank you for your kindness these past few days. You've helped us more than I can say, but I can't let you suffer for taking us in. Victoria's threats are because of us, and that's not fair to you. Micah and I will be fine. You've given me leads on jobs and legal help with the eviction. That's more than enough. I meant what I said. You survived everything that happened to you, and you should be proud of the man you've become. So I know I'm proud to have met you. Thank you again." Zariah and Micah. Elias read the note twice, that strange feeling in his chest growing stronger. They were gone. The woman and child who had crashed into his life and somehow made his empty penthouse feel like a home for the first time in a decade. They had left. He should be relieved. This was what he wanted, wasn't it? His life back to normal, his carefully constructed solitude intact. Then why did he feel like he couldn't breathe? Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator. In the lobby, he stopped Richards. "The woman and child who were staying with me, did you see them leave? Did they say where they were going?" Richards looked surprised at his urgency. "Yes, sir. They left about 2 hours ago. The woman asked for a taxi but didn't mention a destination." Elias ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. Where would they go? She had been evicted. They had no home. An idea struck him. Zariah had mentioned job interviews. Margaret would know where. He called his assistant. "Margaret, I need the addresses of the companies where Zariah Moore has interviews scheduled. Mr. Sterling, I'm not sure she'd want me to." "Please, Margaret," Elias said. his voice softer than his assistant had ever heard it. It's important. After a brief hesitation, Margaret gave him 2 addresses. The first was a restaurant in Midtown, the second an office building in the financial district. Thank you, Elias said. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Sir, you have the board meeting at 3. Cancel it. Mr. Sterling, it's about the Donovan merger. Your brother will be there. Elias paused. The Donovan merger was the biggest deal Sterling Enterprises had pursued in years. If it went through, the company's value would double overnight. Reschedule. For tomorrow, he finally said. And Margaret, don't tell James why. The taxi took him to the restaurant first. The manager confirmed that Zariah had interviewed that morning, but had left hours ago. At the second address, he was told she had never shown up for her appointment. Standing on the busy sidewalk, Elias felt lost, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a homeless teenager. Where would a mother with a small child go with nowhere? Else to turn? The answer came to him suddenly. Leanne. Zariah had mentioned her friend several times, saying they'd known each other since high school. He called Margaret again. I need you to find a woman named Leanne. She's a friend of Zariah Moore. Check social media, phone records, anything. Within 30 minutes, Margaret had an address in Queens. Elias directed his driver there, his heart pounding with an urgency he didn't understand. The building was a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood. Elias felt out of place in his expensive suit as he climbed the stairs to apartment 3B. He hesitated before knocking, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? What would he even say? Before he could decide, the door opened, revealing a young woman with red hair and a suspicious expression. Can I help you? She asked, eyeing his suit. I'm looking for Zariah Moore, Elias said. Is she here? The woman's eyes narrowed. Who's asking? My name is Elias Sterling. I'm... The hotel guy? Leanne's eyes widened. What do you want with... Zariah? I just want to talk to her, please. Leanne seemed to assess him, then opened the door wider. She's not here. She was, but she left about an hour ago. Elias felt his heart sink. Did she say where she was going? Look, I don't know who you are to her, but Zariah's been through enough. If she left your place, she had a reason. I know, Elias said quietly, and I think the reason is me. Something in his tone must have convinced Leanne because her expression softened slightly. She went to see about a room at the women's shelter on 34th Street, she said. My apartment's too small with my sister's family here, and she didn't want to impose. Thank you, Elias said, already turning to leave. Hey, Leanne called after him. Whatever's going on between you two, just know that Zariah doesn't trust. Easily. If she let you in even a little, you must be pretty special. Elias didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and left. The women's shelter was a plain brick building with security at the entrance. Elias approached the front desk, where a stern-faced woman regarded him suspiciously. I'm looking for Zariah Moore, he said. Is she here? We don't give out information about our residents, the woman replied firmly. Please, Elias said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. I just need to know if she and her son are safe. The woman's expression didn't change. I can't help you, sir. Frustrated, Elias stepped back outside. He was about to call his driver when he spotted them, Zariah and Micah sitting on a bench in a small park across the street. Zariah looked tired. Her shoulders slumped as she watched Micah play half-heartedly with a small toy car. Elias crossed the street, his heart pounding. He was a few feet away when Micah spotted him. Mr. Elias, the boy cried, running to him. Zariah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Elias, what are you doing here? Elias knelt to greet Micah, who had thrown his arms around Elias's legs. Hey, buddy, he said softly before looking up at Zariah. You left. She stood, crossing her arms defensively. I had to. You know that. No, I don't. Elias straightened, still holding Micah's hand. You didn't have to leave. Victoria is threatening you because of us, Zariah said. I heard what she said. Victoria would threaten me regardless, Elias replied. She's been looking for leverage. For years. A cool breeze picked up, making Zariah shiver in her thin jacket. Elias noticed Micah was only wearing a light sweater. "It's getting cold," he said. "Where are you staying tonight?" Zariah glanced at the shelter, then back at Elias. "We'll be fine. The shelter turned you away, didn't they?" Elias guessed, seeing the truth in her eyes. "That's why you're sitting out here." "They're full," Zariah admitted. "We're on a waiting list." "Come back to the penthouse," Elias said. "Please." "Elias, I can't—" "Yes," Micah cheered, tugging on Elias's hand. "Can we, Mommy? Please. I miss the trains." Zariah looked at her son's hopeful face, then at Elias. "Why are you doing this?" "I don't know," Elias answered honestly. "All I know is that when I found your note, I couldn't breathe. The thought of you and Micah out here with nowhere to go." He trailed off, not knowing how to express the feelings churning inside him. "Can we talk somewhere warmer?" he asked. "Finally. For Micah's sake." Zariah hesitated, then nodded. "Just to talk." Elias's driver took them to a cozy diner not far from the park. Micah was delighted by the prospect of hot chocolate and soon sat happily coloring on a kid's menu while Zariah and Elias talked in low voices. "I've never done anything like this before," Elias confessed, staring into his coffee cup. "I've never chased after someone." "Why did you?" Zariah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked up, meeting her eyes. "Because when you left, it felt wrong, like when I lost my parents. That same emptiness." The raw honesty in his voice made Zariah's throat tighten. "Elias, I know it doesn't make sense," he continued. "We barely know each other. But these past few days with you and Micah have been— I felt more alive than I have in 10 years. Zariah reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, placed her hand over his. This time, he didn't stiffen or pull away. "What about Victoria?" she asked quietly. "Her threats?" "I've decided not to give in to her blackmail," Elias said firmly. "Whatever she reveals about my past, I'll deal with it." "Are you sure?" It seemed important to keep it private. Elias turned his hand over, tentatively holding hers. "Some things are more important. The simple gesture, the touch that would have been unthinkable days ago, spoke volumes." "Come back," he said softly. "Not forever, just until you find something better. No strings, no expectations." Zariah looked at Micah, happily slurping his hot chocolate, then back at Elias. "Okay," she said finally, "but I need to find a job, a permanent place. I can't depend on you forever." "I know," Elias said, understanding her pride. "And I'll help however I can." When they returned to the penthouse, it felt different, like a choice they were making together, not a circumstance forced upon them. That night, after Micah was asleep, Elias showed Zariah a room she hadn't seen before, his home office, filled with books. "I thought you might like to read something," he said almost shyly. "I noticed you reading to Micah every night." Zariah ran her fingers along the spines of the books, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." As they stood together in the quiet room, surrounded by books, something shifted between them, a barrier falling, a possibility opening. "Elias," Zariah said softly, "can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, though she could see him tense slightly. "That night Victoria mentioned, she said something about the night you almost— and you cut her off. What was she talking about?" Elias was silent for so long that Zariah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "The night before my wedding to Victoria, I found out about her and James. I was destroyed. I went to the roof of this building." He gestured vaguely upward. "I stood on the edge for a long time." Zariah's hand flew to her mouth. "Elias." "I didn't jump, obviously," he continued, his tone deliberately neutral. "But Victoria found me there. She used that moment of weakness against me for years, threatening to tell the board, the press, anyone who would listen, that the great Elias Sterling had nearly killed himself over a woman." Without thinking, Zariah moved closer and placed her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry." Elias looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. "You keep touching me," he observed, but there was no coldness in his voice. "Does it bother you?" Zariah asked, about to withdraw her hand. "No," he said, surprising them both. "It doesn't." The moment hung between them, fragile, charged with something neither was ready to name. "We should get some rest," Elias said finally. "Tomorrow will be busy. I have the board meeting about the Donovan merger." "Is that important?" "Very. If it goes through, Sterling Enterprises will become the largest technology company on the East Coast." He paused. "James will be there." "Will that be a problem?" "James is always a problem," Elias said with a hint of a smile. "But I'll handle him. I always do." The next morning, Zariah woke to find Elias already dressed for his meeting, looking sharp in a tailored suit. Micah was sitting with him at the dining table, both of them eating cereal. "Mommy," Micah called when he saw her. "Mr. Elias says I can watch movies all day." Elias looked slightly embarrassed. "I hired a babysitter, someone Margaret personally vouches for. I thought it might give you time to go to your other job interviews." Zariah was touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." As Elias prepared to leave, he hesitated by the elevator. "Will you be here when I get back?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. Zariah understood the real question beneath his words. "Yes," she promised. "We'll be here." The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "Good," he said simply, and then he was gone. The babysitter, a kind older woman named Mrs. Chen, arrived shortly after. She explained that she was Margaret's mother and had raised 4 children of her own. "Mr. Sterling said you have job interviews," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "Don't worry about your little boy. We'll have a wonderful time." Freed from worry about Micah, Zariah headed to her interviews. The first was promising, an administrative position at a small publishing company. The hours were good, and the salary, while modest, would be enough to rent a small apartment eventually. She was leaving the building when her phone rang. It was a blocked number, but she answered anyway. "Zariah Moore," a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "Victoria Hartley." The voice was cool, precise. "I think we should meet." Zariah's heart raced. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I disagree. I'll be at the Café Laurent in 20 minutes. If you care about Elias at all, you'll be there." Before Zariah could respond, Victoria hung up. She stood on the sidewalk, uncertain. Should she go? Should she call Elias? In the end, curiosity and concern won out. She hailed a taxi to the cafe, a trendy spot in the fashion district. Victoria was already there, looking elegant in a cream-colored business suit, her blonde hair in a perfect chignon. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said as Zariah sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "What do you want?" Zariah asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Straight to the point. I appreciate that." Victoria sipped her espresso. "I want to talk about Elias." "What about him? You care for him, don't you?" Victoria's gaze was penetrating. "I can see it in your eyes. The way you look at him, speak about him. Maybe you even think you love him." Zariah said nothing, unwilling to give Victoria any ammunition. "Let me tell you about Elias Sterling," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a storyteller's rhythm. "He grew up in the foster system. Did he tell you that?" "Yes," Zariah said quietly. "Did he tell you he was abused, beaten so badly at 14 that he spent 2 weeks in the hospital?" Victoria's eyes never left Zariah's face. "Did he tell you he ran away at 16 and lived on the streets?" "Some of it," Zariah answered, her heart aching for the boy Elias had been. "But not all," Victoria surmised. "Elias has always been selective about his story. He tells enough to garner sympathy, but never the whole truth." "And you know the whole truth?" Zariah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I've known Elias for 15 years, Victoria said. "We met in college. I was the rich girl. He was the scholarship student with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. I believed in him when no one else did. I introduced him to my father's business associates. I helped him start his first company. And then you cheated on him with his brother," Zariah said flatly. Victoria's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. "That's a simplification." "Is it? Elias and I were perfect on paper, the ambitious power couple. But living with him," so Victoria shook her head. "He was cold, distant. He couldn't bear to be touched, couldn't open up emotionally. It was like living with a ghost." Despite herself, Zariah found Victoria's words affecting her. Hadn't she seen that same coldness, that same distance? James was warm, present, Victoria continued. What happened between us was wrong, but it wasn't calculated, it was human. What do you want from me? Zariah asked again. Victoria leaned forward. I want you to understand who Elias really is. He's damaged, Zariah, broken inside. He'll never be able to love you the way you deserve. He'll never be able to be a father to your son. The words hit Zariah like a physical blow. You don't know that? I do, Victoria insisted. I spent years trying to fix him, to reach him. It can't be done. I'm not trying to fix him, Zariah said, finding her voice. I just want to know him. Victoria sat back, studying Zariah with new interest. You really do care for him, don't you? How fascinating. She took another sip of her espresso. Would you still care for him if you knew the rest of his story? The parts he's kept hidden? If you're going to tell me, then tell me, Zariah said, growing tired of Victoria's games. Elias Sterling isn't just a foster care success story, Victoria said, her voice dropping. When he was 17, he was arrested for assault. He put a man in the hospital, nearly killed him. Zariah felt her breath catch. It was his foster father, Victoria continued. The man who had abused him 3 years earlier. Elias tracked him down and beat him within an inch of his life. I don't believe you, Zariah said, but doubt had crept into her voice. Victoria reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a manila envelope. See for yourself. Police reports, court records, it's all there. With trembling hands, Zariah took the envelope but didn't open it. The charges were eventually dropped, Victoria said. The foster father had a record of abuse, but the fact remains, Elias has violence in him. It's part of who he is. Zariah thought of the gentle way Elias played with Micah, how carefully he'd held her hand the day before. You're lying, she said, pushing the envelope back across the table. Am I? Victoria's smile was sad. Ask him yourself. Ask him about Frank Donovan. Zariah frowned. Donovan? Like the merger? Victoria nodded. Robert Donovan is the son of Frank Donovan, the man Elias attacked. And now, ironically, Elias needs Robert's company to secure his future. Zariah stood up, suddenly needing to leave. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm done listening. Victoria remained seated, unperturbed. Just one more thing, Zariah. The board meeting today? It's not going well for Elias. James is making a move against him. By the end of the day, Elias Sterling might not be CEO anymore. What are you talking about? James has been gathering support for months. The board is tired of Elias's cold leadership, his isolation. They want someone more personable at the helm. Victoria's smile was triumphant. Someone like James. Why are you telling me this? Because when Elias loses everything today, he's going to need someone, Victoria said. And I want to know if that someone will be you. Zariah left the cafe, her mind spinning. Was Victoria telling the truth? Was Elias in danger of losing his company? And what about the other revelations, his arrest, the violence? She found herself walking toward the Sterling Enterprises building, a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. She had no plan, no idea what she would do when she got there. She just knew she needed to see Elias. The lobby was bustling with people in business attire. Zariah approached the security desk, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked in her simple interview clothes. I need to see Elias Sterling, she said to the guard. It's important. The guard looked skeptical. Do you have an appointment? No, but then I'm afraid I can't help you. Mr. Sterling is in a board meeting. Zariah was about to argue when she heard a commotion near the elevators. A group of men in expensive suits was exiting, talking loudly. Among them was James Sterling, looking triumphant. It's done, he was saying to an older man beside him. The vote was clear. Elias is out. Zariah felt her heart drop. Victoria had been telling the truth. Excuse me, she said, approaching James despite her better judgment. Where is Elias? James turned, surprise crossing his handsome face when he recognized her. Well, the house guest, what are you doing here? Where is he? Zariah repeated, ignoring his tone. My brother. Still upstairs, I imagine, cleaning out his office. James's smile was cold. Though I'd give him some space if I were you. He's not in the best mood after being voted out of his own company. Zariah pushed past him, heading for the elevators. James caught her arm. "Hey, you can't go up there." "Watch me," Zariah said, pulling away from him. Something in her expression must have convinced James not to stop her. He shrugged and let her. "Go, your funeral," he called after her. "Though I'd be happy to offer you a job when you're done with him. My door is always open for a beautiful woman." Zariah ignored him, stepping into the elevator. A security guard tried to stop her, but an older woman, who Zariah realized must be Margaret, intervened. "It's all right, Frank, let her go up." To Zariah, she said quietly, 14th floor, end of the hall. He needs someone right now." When the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, Zariah found a hushed atmosphere. Employees were speaking, in whispers, glancing toward the large corner office at the end of the hall. Through the glass walls, she could see Elias. He stood with his back to the door, staring out at the city below. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity of his stance. She knocked softly on the door before entering. Elias didn't turn around. "I said I wanted to be left alone, Margaret," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "It's not Margaret," Zariah said softly. "It's me." Elias turned then, surprise evident on his face. "Zariah, what are you doing here?" "I heard what happened," she said, closing the door behind her. "With the board vote." His expression hardened. "News travels fast." "Victoria told me," Zariah admitted. "She asked to meet me." "Victoria?" Elias's voice sharpened. "When?" "Earlier today. She told me things about your past." Elias went very still. "What things?" Zariah took a deep breath. "About your arrest." "About Frank Donovan." She saw it then, a flash of that violence Victoria had described, quickly masked by Elias's practiced control. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And now you're here to what? Express your disgust, your fear?" "No," Zariah said, taking a step toward him. "I'm here because I was worried about you." Elias laughed, a hollow sound. "Worried about me? I just lost my company. The company I built from nothing. James and the board took it from me just like they took everything else." "I know," Zariah said softly. "And I'm sorry." "I don't want your pity," Elias snapped, echoing words he'd said days ago. "It's not pity," Zariah said, taking another step toward him. "It's caring. There's a difference." Something in Elias seemed to break at her words. He turned away, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "You should go," he said, his voice rough. "Take Micah and go. I have nothing left to offer you now." "Is that what you think this is about?" Zariah asked, disbelief in her voice. "That I only stayed because of what you could give? Us, didn't you?" Elias turned back to face her, his expression bitter. "A roof over your head, help with jobs, legal aid. That's why you came back?" "No," Zariah said firmly. "I came back because of you. Because when I was with you, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Safe, seen, understood." Elias's bitter expression faltered. "Zariah, I don't care about your company or your money," she continued, moving closer still. "I care about the man who made pancakes with my son, who told me about his past even though it hurt, who came looking for us when we left." She was standing directly in front of him now, close enough to see the turmoil in his eyes. "Victoria told me you were violent," she said quietly, "that you have darkness in you." She was right, Elias admitted, his voice low. "I nearly killed Frank Donovan. I would have if someone hadn't stopped me." "Why?" "Because he hurt children. Not just me. Others, and he was going to keep hurting them." Elias's gaze was unflinching. "I don't regret what I did. What I regret is not finishing the job." Zariah reached up, hesitating only briefly before placing her hand against his cheek. "That's not darkness, Elias. That's justice. That's protection." Elias closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into it almost unconsciously. "You don't know everything I've done, Zariah." "I know enough," she said softly. "I know who you are now, the man who's standing in front of me." His eyes opened, meeting, hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "And who is that?" "Someone worth knowing," Zariah said simply. "Someone worth caring for." For a long moment they stood there, something unspoken passing between them. Then slowly, tentatively, Elias raised his hand to cover hers, where it rested against his cheek. "I've lost everything today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everything," Zariah replied. "Not yet." Outside the office, employees watched in amazement as Elias Sterling, the man known for his frozen heart, his untouchable nature, stood with a woman's hand against his cheek, his own hand covering hers. His eyes closed in what looked like peace for the first time in 10 years. And down in the lobby, Victoria Hartley watched the security feed on a guard's monitor, her perfect smile fading as she realized that despite all her machinations, despite taking his company, she had lost the one thing she had truly wanted, power over Elias Sterling's heart. Because that now belonged to someone else. 3 days after losing his company, Elias sat in his penthouse surrounded by paperwork. The coffee table was covered with documents, his laptop open to spreadsheets and financial reports. He'd barely slept, the dark circles under his eyes evidence of his exhaustion. "You need to rest," Zariah said, bringing him a fresh cup of coffee. Elias took the cup gratefully. "I can't. Not until I figure this out." "Figure what out?" "How to get my company back." His determination was unwavering. "James thinks he's won, but he doesn't know what I have planned." Since the board vote, Zariah and Micah had remained at the penthouse. Elias had withdrawn into his work, spending hours on the phone with lawyers and financial advisors. But each night he made time to join them for dinner, and each morning he made breakfast with Micah, small moments of normalcy in the chaos. "Mr. Elias, can we play trains now?" Micah asked, appearing in the doorway with hopeful eyes. "You promised." Elias's expression softened as he looked at the boy. "I did, didn't I? Give me 5 minutes to finish this email." Zariah watched as Elias typed rapidly, his focus intense. He had changed in the days since losing Sterling Enterprises. The cold perfectionist was still there, but alongside him was a man who laughed at Micah's jokes, who touched Zariah's hand when passing her in the kitchen, who seemed more human with each passing day. True to his word, 5 minutes later, Elias was on the floor with Micah, helping him build an elaborate train track across the living room. Zariah sat on the couch, folding laundry and watching them, with a warm feeling in her chest. Her phone rang, interrupting the peaceful scene. It was the publishing company where she'd interviewed. "Ms. Moore, this is David Klein from Horizon Publishing. I'm pleased to inform you that we'd like to offer you the position." Zariah's heart leapt. "That's wonderful. Thank you so much." The salary is $45,000 annually, with benefits after 90 days. Would that work for you? It wasn't much, but it was stable, enough to rent a small apartment, to build a life for her and Micah. "Yes, that would be fine. When do you need me to start?" "Is Monday too soon?" "Monday is perfect," Zariah said, relief washing over her. "Thank you again." When she hung up, both Elias and Micah were looking at her expectantly. "I got the job at Horizon Publishing," she told them, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I start Monday." "Congratulations," Elias said, genuine happiness in his eyes. "You deserve it. Now we can get our own place," Micah said excitedly, then his face fell. "But I'll miss Mr. Elias in the trains." An awkward silence fell. They hadn't discussed what would happen next, whether Zariah and Micah would stay or go. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "You don't have to leave," Elias said finally, his voice careful, neutral. "Not right away, not until you're ready." "Elias," Zariah began, not sure what she wanted to say, "we can't stay here forever." "Why not?" The question was simple, direct, but loaded with meaning. Before Zariah could respond, the elevator chimed. Elias frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. The doors opened to reveal James Sterling, looking as polished and smug as ever in an expensive suit with Sterling Enterprises logo on the cufflinks. Elias's logo, Elias's design. "Brother," James said, stepping into the penthouse uninvited. "We need to talk." Elias stood, his body tense. "How did you get up here? Security should have stopped you." "I'm the CEO of Sterling Enterprises now," James replied with a cold smile. "The doormen work for me. The security works for me. Everything that was yours is mine." "Not everything," Elias said quietly, glancing at Zariah and Micah. James followed his gaze, his smile widening when he saw Zariah. "Ah, the lovely Ms. Moore. Still here, I see, though I'm surprised, now that my brother is just a regular unemployed. Millionaire instead of a billionaire CEO. I'd have thought you'd move on to greener pastures." "Get out," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "Not until we talk," James insisted. "Privately." Zariah stood. "Micah, let's go to our room for a bit." "But I'm playing trains with Mr. Elias," Micah protested. "We'll finish later, buddy," Elias promised, his eyes never leaving James. "I just need to talk to my brother for a few minutes." Once Zariah and Micah had left the room, James walked to the bar and poured himself a drink without asking. "Nice place. I think I'll buy the building now that I'm in charge. Would that bother you, having me as your landlord?" "What do you want, James?" Elias asked, ignoring the taunt. James took a sip of his drink. "The Donovan merger is falling apart." "Is it?" Elias couldn't keep the satisfaction from his voice. "You know it is. Robert Donovan is refusing to move forward unless you're brought back in some capacity." James's smug expression faltered. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing, he didn't." "Already know." Elias moved to the window, looking out over the city. "Robert's father was my foster father, the man I put in the hospital. Robert was just a kid then, but he remembers what his father did to me, to others. He's a good man, unlike his father, unlike you." James's face darkened. "You're sabotaging the company?" "No, I'm protecting my legacy," Elias corrected. "Sterling Enterprises is my creation. You might be sitting in my chair, but you'll never have what it takes to run it properly." "The board disagrees," James shot back. "They think you're too cold, too isolated. They want someone with people skills at the helm. And they think that's you?" Elias laughed, the sound bitter. "You who slept with my fiancée, who embezzled from the company." "Ancient history," James waved dismissively. "Besides, I've convinced them I've changed. I'm a family man now. Did you know Victoria and I are engaged?" The news hit Elias like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. "Congratulations. You deserve each other. The wedding is in 6 months. A big society affair. It'll be all over the papers." James drained his glass. "Now about Donovan. What will it take to get you to convince him to move forward with the merger?" "Why would I help you?" Elias asked. "Because despite everything, it's still your company. Your name is still on the building." James set down his glass. "And because if you don't, I'll be forced to take drastic measures." "What kind of measures?" "The board has authorized me to change the company name," James said casually, "to remove all trace of you from Sterling Enterprises. Your legacy erased." Elias felt a surge of anger but kept his voice steady. "You wouldn't." "I would unless you help with Donovan." James pulled a document from his jacket pocket. "I've drawn up a consulting agreement. You come in, smooth things over with Donovan, and in exchange, the company name stays intact." Elias took the document but didn't open it. "I'll think about it. Don't think too long. The board meets again on Friday. If I don't have your answer by then..." James let the threat hang in the air. "Is that all?" Elias asked coldly. "For now." James moved toward the elevator, then paused. "One more thing. Victoria mentioned she had a lovely chat with your house guest. She seems quite taken with you." "This Zariah. I wonder if she'd feel the same if she knew everything about you." "Victoria already told her about Donovan," Elias said. "Yes, but did she tell her about the money? About where your initial funding really came from?" James's smile was cruel. "How interesting that you haven't shared that particular detail." After James left, Elias stood motionless, the consulting agreement crushed in his fist. He felt trapped, cornered, feelings he had sworn never to experience again after leaving the foster system. "Elias," Zariah's voice came from behind him. "Is everything okay?" He turned to find her watching him with concern. How much had she heard? "James wants me to help save the Donovan merger," he said, avoiding the more personal parts of the conversation. "He's using my legacy as leverage. Will you do it?" Elias sighed, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know. Part of me wants to watch him fail, but that company, I built it from nothing. It matters to me." Zariah moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. What was James talking about at the end? About money? So she had heard. Elias tensed, then made a decision. No more secrets, no more walls. When I was 18, after the charges were dropped for the Donovan incident, I was homeless, he began. I was working 3 jobs trying to save enough for community college. One night, I stopped a mugging outside a restaurant. The man I helped was Richard Hartley. Victoria's father, Zariah guessed. Elias nodded. A wealthy banker. He was impressed by my actions, by my story. He offered me a job, then paid for my education. Later, he invested in my first business venture. That's how I met Victoria, at a dinner at her father's house. So your initial funding came from the Hartleys, Zariah said, understanding dawning. That's what James was threatening to reveal. Richard's investment was legitimate, Elias clarified, but in the story I've told publicly, I built everything myself, with no help. It's part of my brand, the self-made billionaire. If people knew I had help, they'd still know you worked hard for everything you have, Zariah said firmly. Getting help doesn't diminish your achievements. Her acceptance, her understanding, moved him deeply. Not everyone would see it that way. Then they don't matter, Zariah said simply. Elias found himself smiling despite the weight on his shoulders. How do you do that? Do what? Make everything seem so clear, so simple. Zariah shrugged. Life is complicated enough without us making it harder. That night, after Micah was asleep, Elias and Zariah sat on the balcony sharing a bottle of wine. The city lights twinkled below them, a carpet of stars above. I've been thinking about James's offer, Elias said. I'm going to help with the Donovan merger. Really? After everything James has done? Zariah was surprised. Not for James, for the company. For the employees who depend on Sterling Enterprises for their livelihoods. Elias swirled the wine in his glass. And because I have a plan. What kind of plan? Elias's smile was enigmatic. One that might just get me my company back. Is that what you want? Zariah asked softly. To go back to being CEO? To that life? The question caught Elias off guard. He'd been so focused on reclaiming what was taken from him that he hadn't considered if it was what he truly wanted. I don't know, he admitted. 10 days ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, he didn't finish the thought. But his eyes resting on Zariah's face in the moonlight said what words couldn't. I start my new job on Monday, Zariah said, changing the subject slightly. Micah and I should start looking for our own place. You could stay, Elias said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Both of you. Not as guests. As... What? Zariah asked when he didn't continue. Elias set down his wine glass. I don't know how to do this, Zariah. I've been alone for so long. I've kept people at a distance because it felt safer. And now I find myself terrified at the thought of you leaving. The admission cost him, but he forced himself to continue. These past days with you and Micah, you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing. Zariah's eyes glistened in the moonlight. Elias, I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly. I know it's too soon. I know we're still getting to know each other. I don't want you to leave. Not yet. Zariah reached across the small table between them, taking his hand. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. Let's just take it one day at a time. The next morning, Elias prepared for his meeting with James and Robert Donovan. He dressed carefully in his best suit, armor for the battle ahead. As he adjusted his tie, Zariah appeared in the doorway of his bedroom. You look ready for war, she observed. In a way, I am, Elias replied. Then take this, she said, handing him a small object. It was a tiny toy train that Micah had given her. For luck, Elias smiled, tucking it into his pocket. Thank you. At Sterling Enterprises, the atmosphere was tense. Employees watched nervously as Elias strode through the lobby, his presence commanding despite no longer being CEO. Margaret met him at the elevator. Mr. Sterling, she said warmly, it's good to see you back. I'm not back yet, Margaret, Elias replied, but I might be soon. The boardroom was filled with executives and board members when Elias entered. James sat at the head of the table, Elias's former place, with Victoria beside him. Robert Donovan, a serious man in his 50s, sat opposite. "Elias," Robert stood, to greet him with a genuine handshake. "It's been too long." "Robert," Elias nodded. "Thank you for waiting to move forward with the merger." James cleared his throat. "Now that we're all here, let's get down to business. Elias has agreed to act as a consultant to ensure a smooth transition." The meeting proceeded, with James presenting his vision for the merged companies. Elias noticed how often James stumbled over technical details, how the board members looked to Elias for clarification despite James's position at the head of the table. Finally, Robert Donovan spoke up. "I appreciate the presentation, James, but I'm not convinced this is the right direction. The merger plans I discussed with Elias were quite different." James's smile faltered. "Well, I'm sure we can adjust." "May I?" Elias interrupted, standing. All eyes turned to him. "Robert, if I may, I'd like to present an alternative approach to the merger." Over the next hour, Elias outlined a vision so compelling, so clearly superior to James's, that the entire room was captivated. He spoke with the authority of someone who knew the company inside and out, because he did. It was his creation, his life's work. When he finished, Robert nodded approvingly. "That's more like it. That's the kind of thinking that made me want to merge with Sterling Enterprises in the first place." James's face had grown increasingly red during Elias's presentation. "This is all very interesting," he said through gritted teeth, "but I'm the CEO now. Any merger will proceed under my terms." "Actually," Robert said calmly, "my agreement with Sterling Enterprises includes a clause requiring Elias Sterling's active involvement in the company. Without him, there is no merger." "What?" James looked stunned. "That wasn't in the paperwork." "It was in the original agreement I signed with Elias months ago," Robert clarified. "Didn't you read all the documents when you took over?" Victoria touched James's arm. "Darling, perhaps we should call a recess to discuss this privately." Before James could respond, the boardroom door opened, and an elderly man in an impeccable suit entered. Elias recognized him immediately. Richard Hartley, Victoria's father. "Richard," Elias said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't," Richard replied, his voice stern. He looked at his daughter and James. "I received some disturbing news about the company, about what's been happening here." Victoria's perfect composure slipped. "Daddy, what are you doing here?" "Cleaning up your mess, as usual," Richard said sharply. He turned to the board members. "Ladies and gentlemen, as the primary investor in Sterling Enterprises, I have concerns about recent leadership changes." James stood up. "Mr. Hartley, with all due respect, the board has voted based on incomplete information," Richard cut him off. "My daughter neglected to mention her personal involvement in this coup or the fact that the two of you are engaged. A clear conflict of interest." The board members exchanged concerned glances. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "I've reviewed the company's financial reports from the past week. The decisions made under James Sterling's leadership have already resulted in a 5% drop in stock value. Unacceptable." "Richard," Elias said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" Richard turned to him, his expression softening slightly. "What I should have done years ago, put the company back in the hands of the man who built it." He addressed the board directly. "I move for an immediate re-vote on company leadership, with all facts on the table." One of the board members spoke up. "I second that motion." James's face had gone pale. "You can't do this." "I just did," Richard said coldly. "Victoria, James, I suggest you excuse yourselves while the board deliberates." After they left, Richard pulled Elias aside. "I owe you an apology, Elias. I should have seen what Victoria was doing years ago. She manipulated you, manipulated me. I was blind to it because she's my daughter." "Why now?" Elias asked. "Why help me after all this time?" Richard sighed. "A young woman came to see me yesterday. Zariah Moore. She told me what Victoria had been doing, the blackmail, the threats. She showed me evidence of James's financial misconduct that you had discovered years ago." Elias was stunned. "Zariah came to you." "She's quite remarkable," Richard said with a small smile. "Reminded me of you when you were younger. Determined, principled, she made me see what I'd been ignoring. The board's deliberation was brief. The vote was unanimous. Elias would be reinstated as CEO, effective immediately. James would be removed from the company entirely. The merger with Donovan Technologies would proceed under Elias's terms. As Elias left the boardroom, triumphant, he found Victoria waiting in the hallway. Her perfect facade had cracked, her mascara smudged from tears. "You won," she said bitterly. "Again." "This wasn't about winning, Victoria," Elias replied. "It was about what's right." "My father has disowned me," she said, her voice breaking. "James has left me, I have nothing." For a moment, Elias felt a flicker of the old pain, the old betrayal. But it was distant now, a scar rather than an open wound. "You have yourself," he said finally. "Start over. Build something of your own instead of trying to take what others have built." Victoria looked at him in surprise. "You're not gloating?" "No," Elias agreed. "I'm just free of the past, of you." He walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the hallway. The last chapter of his old life finally closed. When Elias returned to the penthouse that evening, he found Zariah in the kitchen, cooking a dinner while Micah set the table. The domesticity of the scene, the warmth of it, made his heart swell. "You went to see Richard Hartley," he said without preamble. Zariah turned, spatula in hand. "I did." "Why?" "Because you needed help," she said simply, "and because it was the right thing to do." "How did you even know how to find him?" Zariah smiled. "Margaret helped. She's very loyal to you, you know." Elias moved closer, taking the spatula from her hand and setting it aside. "I got my company back." "I know." Margaret called. Zariah's eyes were bright with happiness for him. "Congratulations. James is out. Victoria, too. The merger with Donovan is going forward." Elias took her, hands in his. "Everything is back to the way it was." "Is that what you want?" Zariah asked again, echoing her question from the night before. "To go back to the way things were?" "No," Elias said firmly. "I want to move forward. With you. With Micah. If you'll have me." Zariah's breath caught. "Elias." "I know it's fast," he said. "I know we've only known each other for a short time. But when you crashed into my life, you changed everything. You made me feel again, after 10 years of numbness. What about your work? You'll be busy rebuilding, managing the merger." "I'll delegate more, work less hours, be home for dinner every night." Elias's voice was earnest. "I don't want to be the cold, isolated CEO anymore. I want a life, a real one, with you." Zariah's eyes filled with tears. "What about Micah?" "I love Micah," Elias said, the words coming easily now. "I love his curiosity, his kindness, his trains. I want to be in his life, in whatever way you'll allow." "And me?" Zariah whispered. "What about me?" Elias reached up to touch her cheek, the gesture no longer foreign or uncomfortable. "You're the woman who melted my frozen heart. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you crashed into my hotel." "Mr. Elias," Micah called from the dining room, "is the food ready? I'm hungry." They both laughed, the moment broken but not lost. "We should feed him," Zariah said, wiping away a happy tear. "Wait," Elias said, still holding her hands. "You haven't answered me. Will you stay? Will you give us a chance?" Zariah looked into his eyes, no longer ice but warm blue sky. "Yes," she said, "we'll stay. We'll see where this goes, day by day." "I can work with that," Elias said, his smile genuine and unreserved. That night, after Micah was asleep, Elias and Zariah stood on the balcony again, looking out at the city. "I never thought I could have this," Elias admitted. "A family. Love. I thought those things weren't meant for someone like me." "Someone like you deserves all the love in the world," Zariah said, leaning against his side. Slowly, still somewhat tentatively, Elias put his arm around her shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but for a man who hadn't touched or been touched in 10 years, it was monumental. "You know," Zariah said thoughtfully, "for a man with a supposedly frozen heart, you're remarkably warm." Elias laughed softly. "Only with you," As they stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth against the cool night air, Elias realized that the emptiness that had defined his life for so long was gone. In its place was something new and precious: hope. Hope for a future filled with Zariah's laughter, Micah's innocent joy, and the love he'd denied himself for too long. The ice had melted, washed away by the fiery soul of a woman who had crashed into his life and changed it forever. And for that, Elias Sterling was profoundly, completely grateful. 6 months later, Elias stood in his office at Sterling Enterprises, looking at 3 framed photographs on his desk. The first showed him shaking hands with Robert Donovan, the merger successfully completed. The second was of him, Zariah, and Micah at the zoo, all 3 smiling broadly. The third, and newest, was from just last weekend. Elias down on one knee in front of Zariah, a ring box open in his hand, Micah jumping with excitement beside them. She had said yes, as Elias gathered his things to head home, at 5 p.m., a time he never would have left. The office in his previous life. He smiled at the thought of the family waiting for him. The family that had begun with a car crash on a stormy night, when a fiery soul had collided with his frozen heart and changed everything. His phone buzzed with a text from Zariah. "Micah and I made lasagna. Don't be late. We love you." "On my way," Elias typed back. "I love you both." And he did. With all of his once frozen, now thawed heart. The end.